Hi, I'm Chuck DeVore. I'm the Vice President of National Initiatives with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And today it is my honor to be filling in for the boss who unfortunately couldn't make it. Kevin Roberts, however, will be back regularly scheduled. Stay tuned to this channel and time and station, and he'll be on next Monday. It's my great honor to introduce a very interesting topic today. We're going to be talking about the Lone Star State taking on big tech. And we have two amazing guests to join us. We have Attorney General Ken Paxton, the AG of the great state of Texas, as well as James Poulos, who is a commentator about things going on in today's society. He's a journalist and an author and has some amazing insight into this moment in history where we find ourselves so dependent on entities like Twitter and Amazon and Facebook, et cetera. So before we get going with the first question to Attorney General Paxton, I think it's important for individuals to kind of set the stage as to what we're dealing with here. If you look at the First Amendment as the very first part of the Bill of Rights, that is a restriction on government getting involved in speech. And when you think about the forms of speech as they existed back then, you could stand on a street corner and you could say, I don't like President George Washington for the following reason. Or you could start a newspaper and you could distribute that newspaper. Today, however, we have this interesting situation where the city square, if you will, is more electronic. It's through the internet. And we're finding some restrictions then on speech that would probably cause our founding fathers to look askance at that and say, well, if you can't get your message out because people are essentially preventing you from even being on the equivalent of the sidewalk in 2021, we may have a problem with that. And so what I'd like to do is start off by asking General Paxton about this lawsuit that he filed against Google. It's an antitrust lawsuit that was filed a little over a month ago that looks into these monopolistic practices that Google has been engaging with regards its advertising. How it essentially has created a market that you have to deal with Google or you're not in business at all. So, General Paxton, could you illuminate us about this lawsuit and how it connects today with some of these other free speech problems that we're beginning to see?
Well, Chuck, first of all, thanks for hosting this. I think this is a really important topic, one that if we don't address now, we may never have the opportunity to address. So for me, coming into my second term, I realized that as these tech companies were becoming more and more powerful, companies like Google, that they were growing, they have more power, they have more influence, they have more money. And if we didn't deal with these issues, these monopolistic behaviors, they would affect all kinds of issues, including potentially free speech, consumer behavior. And so we started looking during my second term, beginning of my second term, we started going out to Palo Alto and just having conversations with lawyers, with experts in technology, with professors, people that understood. We weren't particularly looking to sue anybody, but we wanted to understand what was going on. And we sort of were led down a path to realizing that, yeah, there's lots of issues and lots of companies that we need to look at, but Google is a particular company that has a significant monopolistic power over advertising on the internet. And the way it works is pretty simple. It's complex in the technology, but the idea is pretty simple. They represent almost all the buyers of advertising on the internet. They also represent almost all the sellers of advertising on the internet, and they control the exchange between the two. So they know all the information that's going on between the two. So they control the entire market. And so when people tell you that the internet's free, it's not really free when you have advertising being controlled by one company, and consumers end up paying a lot higher prices. Companies pay a lot higher prices, which passes it on to consumers. And when you have one company controlling all of that, with this massive market, it becomes a real problem.
So thank you for that explanation. James, I'd like to bring you in here because what the Attorney General just outlined is a classic antitrust issue, right? You have this natural monopoly, perhaps. You have vertical integration. Perhaps this would invoke memories of the breakup of AT&T, or before that of Standard Oil over 100 years ago. How does this relate, though, to the more pressing, perhaps more publicly high-profile issue of recent days, which is, for example, the extinguishing of Parler, a competitor to Twitter, that was essentially removed from the internet through Amazon Web Services refusing to carry them. Are these two things connected in a way that makes sense to our viewers?
Well, thanks, Chuck. The AG is right, and those things are connected. During my, my work day in and day out at the Claremont Institute, helping to run the website, The American Mind, we've touched on this stuff in the past, and how how big tech increasingly works as a unit. Jack from Twitter insisted that that the activity to basically deplatform Donald Trump was not coordinated. I think that it is colorably coordinated, even if they didn't meet in a smoke-filled room and all make the decision at the same time. This is happening because what we've discovered is, it's not just isolated platforms making their own business decisions about what kind of content moderation they want to have on their site. These are companies that have become part of the strategic infrastructure of the United States of America. There's a reason why their lobbying outfits are so huge. A company like Google just couldn't exist without the deep state, without the NSA, without Five Eyes. The CIA runs on Amazon Web Services. So, really the strategic infrastructure of the government and of these big tech companies are becoming one and the same thing. And when that force is applied in an organized way, in such a blatant and significant intervention in our country's politics and policy, as what we've seen over the course of this month, then that's a game changer. This isn't just market forces doing what market forces do. This isn't just private companies trying to maximize shareholder value. They've crossed a Rubicon, and considering the fact that not only have they crossed that Rubicon, but they've done it in the context of what I think is clear, trust-like activity, trust formation. You can see the way that especially over the Obama years, the ways that Google and other big tech companies really just hoovered up many, many smaller firms to create, as you described, this sort of one ring to rule them all mentality and effect on commerce, advertising, other things. It is the kind of situation where it's a breach, really, of the distinction between public sector and private sector activity, and the concentration of power that has taken on this oligarchic flavor, both in big tech and in big government, are being applied together for partisan and for ideological reasons.
So, General Paxton, your antitrust lawsuit, along with those of many other states' attorneys general against Google, this affects the advertising part of the market, although, as you pointed out, it's a vertically integrated monopoly, right? They're not only selling the ads, but they're controlling at the buy end as well. This seems like a relatively esoteric issue, though. I mean, not a lot of Americans have bought ads on Google or any other social media ads. Explain to me the potential nexus between your lawsuit and allowing a more vigorous discourse on the internet. How does your lawsuit, for example, affect the issue of people, for example, not being deplatformed or erased from the internet? Is there a connection between those two?
There's absolutely a connection. There's monopolistic behavior here by Google and other companies. So there's no choice for the consumer if they are deplatformed. If there were competition in this marketplace, if Google, the way I like to put it is, Google's like, they're like, we have a baseball game, they're the pitcher, the catcher, the hitter, and the umpire. There's nobody else involved in the game. Or it would be like Goldman Sachs owning the New York Stock Exchange and representing buyers and sellers, and there being no other exchange. So if there's no competition, if there's no other inputs to the system, then they can control speech. Then we have a real problem when that's the place that most people go for speech. and they get to say who can be on there, who cannot. So if you can eliminate some of the monopolistic behavior, then we start having more choices, and we don't have companies stepping in to limit free speech in a way that would allow them to stop people from getting their message out.
So, James, you often hear from our libertarian friends that there's really nothing wrong here, right? That these monopolies wouldn't exist unless they were providing value to the consumer, unless they were, efficient. So, what do you say to critics that would suggest that there is no room here whatsoever for any sort of government intervention? That if you want to have your own Parler app or Twitter or Google, go ahead and invent it. What would you say to those critics?
Well, first, I would say that the goal right now should not be to invent another Google. We've got too many Googles already, but to invent an anti-Google. And there are some good tech guys and tech firms out there, startups that are working on doing exactly that, figuring out ways to restructure the everyday internet in a way that allows ordinary people to speak freely, to organize freely, to exchange value freely. And to do so in a way that is protected from, from sort of content moderation turned into a license for tyranny. The reality is that if a country does not control its own internet, then it's hard to see how that country is really sovereign. That's a brave new world to enter into. Other countries around the world, friends and adversaries alike, are taking a look at what's going on with big tech in the United States and saying, we want no part of this. We want to be sovereigns of our own internet. There is an open question constitutionally as to how control over the internet or internets is to be structured in the United States. This goes far beyond simple libertarian questions about the market versus the government. Many Americans, obviously over 73, 74 million Trump voters, but then an even bigger constituency beyond that. They want digital tools that protect and strengthen their ability to work and to raise families and to have some agency and some control over their association, their communication. And right now, what we have are large companies that are systematically denying them that sort of user experience. There are alternatives. There are still some good encrypted chat platforms out there, but the feds have had it in for double-ended encryption, for instance. Many skeptics of cryptocurrency. So some of the better tools that do provide market choice to Americans looking for free association and free communication, those things are being threatened right now by government and by their allies in big tech who want those tools taken off the table.
Thank you. So, Governor Paxton, could you for a moment elucidate on this challenge that we have regarding speech and the line between speech and illegality? So by that, I mean, some of the apologists for what's going on right now regarding the limitations on speech say, well, we don't want our platform used to promote, for example, violence, or we don't want our platform used to promote law breaking or insurrection or conspiracy to commit criminal acts. And yet, at the same time, you hear constant complaints of, for example, regimes like the Islamic Republic of Iran or the People's Republic of China using these same platforms to promote policies calling for the destruction, for example, of the state of Israel or to justify genocide. You also hear constant complaints about the internet being used for human trafficking, including the exploitation of children. So how do you draw the line? Is there anything special about these platforms, or is it simply whatever is illegal in real life, right? If you're speaking to somebody in person, the same thing is illegal if you're simply using a tool as we are right now with this live stream. Could you help us out with how law needs to look at these justifications that you hear from the likes of Facebook and Google and Twitter as to why they should be infringing on speech?
Well, so that's a complicated issue. I think if I were these companies, I would look at what the Supreme Court has said about limitations on speech. I mean, there are certain limitations on free speech. They're very limited. And if I were these companies, that's what I would look at. The challenge that we have now is that's not what they're doing. They are making arbitrary, I would say, arbitrary and capricious decisions about speech based on whatever that company's view is. And what that ultimately means is there's going to be a lot of unfairness, and there's going to be a lot of dissension when they cut you off or cut somebody off who should have the right to say what they want to say, as long as it's not illegal. And remember, these companies also advertise themselves as platforms for free speech with very little limitation, at least not political limitations. And so that also creates a little bit of a problem from the consumer standpoint, in the consumer saying, hey, you promised me free speech, but you're not really delivering that. And so there's potential consumer fraud here, that consumers are not getting what they think they're paying for.
So James, listening to what General Paxton just said, couldn't you argue, though, that we certainly don't have a unlimited right to, for example, use the New York Times or the Washington Post's op-ed page to publish whatever we wish to publish, right? It's a private entity. They exercise editorial content restrictions, and so how is that any different than from what Facebook or Twitter is doing?
Well, it's a good question. And to a degree, there is not much of a difference, or there hasn't been in the past. I mean, we've seen how these platforms have evolved. We've seen how they have moved, as General Paxton suggested, from a more or less open speech friendly posture to one where they are working really hand in glove with politicians, with government officials, to virtually establish a religion, a woke religion. The tech companies increasingly share a culture of best practices when it comes to content moderation, and increasingly that standard of best practices for content moderation is being subsumed within the hate speech framework of critical race theory, of wokeness, and you can see it playing out in real time. So I do think that there is a real claim that can be made against these companies as far as deceptive practices go. And I think, the broader question here is what other end game is being promised at this point, other than, in effect, federal internet police, whose job it is to spend time on all the platforms, with bots that are programmed to do the same, 24/7, always on capabilities, seeking out and punishing and canceling people who not only say the quote unquote wrong thing, but increasingly who fail to say quote unquote the right thing conspicuously and publicly. This is a major politicization of speech, and undercuts the claim that these companies are simply standard market actors serving a role that isn't akin to publishing and is more like simply providing a forum. The best practices of content moderation under sort of woke doctrine that we see taking over not just tech but education and finance and other spheres is one that sees a justice as requiring a constant police action against speech and speakers on the internet who fail to meet this sort of extra constitutional criteria of which speech is good and bad under that ideological framework.
Interesting. So General Paxton, help us out with your lawsuit against Google that has been joined by, about 10 or 12 other states attorneys general. Could you kind of walk us through the timeline as to what are the next steps? And then help us with understanding, if you're successful, what do you think would be the practical fallout from that? What would happen next? So give us a timeline, help people to understand who've never filed an antitrust lawsuit before, what's going to come next, and then what might happen if you're successful.
Well, the first thing I should say is that antitrust has not been used that much recently. The last really big antitrust case was Microsoft 20 years ago, approximately. And so it was kind of presumed that antitrust law was kind of, almost irrelevant. So this is kind of unusual. And this is, I think, the largest antitrust case potentially in the history of the world. And at the same time we have our antitrust lawsuit going on, I should also say that the backdrop is that the Department of Justice filed one in October on a different theory of search related to their search engine, and how that platform isn't quite working. And then after we filed, some other states filed another search case similar to DOJ's. And so you've got really 3 different lawsuits, 2 state lawsuits, and then a federal lawsuit going on at the same time. The timelines of all of these are, who knows exactly how those are going to play out. We filed in Texas because we were hopeful that if we filed in Texas that it would go a little faster. We filed ours. We're waiting for our first real hearing. And so when that happens, I'm not sure. I will say this. I don't think that I'm going to be satisfied with what the European Union did, because they have also sued Google. They settled with Google for billions of dollars. When you look at what Google makes in a year, 130 billion or 125 billion, whatever it is, it's a lot of money. And they're basically just paying a tax to the European Union. And then they make more money the following year because they've even tightened their grip on the market even further. I'm not interested necessarily in the money, although they may end up having to pay money to our state, to other states, and to the federal government. What I'm really interested in is in structural change so that we create competition. And for those who say, libertarians maybe, who say that, it's private business, we should let them do what they want. I am definitely someone who believes in the free market and competition and innovation. But when company becomes so powerful and so big and so dominant that they basically cut off innovation, and consumers no longer have that innovation working for them, and competition for lower prices and competition for a better product, then we have a problem, and the consumer is now being harmed by a business. Then that's when government steps in and says, hey, maybe we need to break some of this up to allow that innovation, to allow that creativity, to allow our free markets to work. And so that's what we're trying to do here. And, maybe there's a place for part of what is Google to be separated off so that it allows others to come in and compete, either representing buyers, representing sellers, or maybe controlling the exchange. That would be something that we would think about. Nothing's off the table. Everything's on the table to consider at this point.
So I'd like to pose this question to both of you, General Paxton and James Poulos. The issue of the modern internet, and especially brought to light during this COVID-19 pandemic of the last year, where increasingly people are relying on the internet to conduct business, to be able to order groceries, to even just survive. And to what degree now have the tools that we have grown accustomed to using on the internet, to what degree have they become similar to things like water and electricity, or even roads, kind of like a common carrier, if you will, something that people just can't live without? Is there an argument that can be made that because modern life is essentially not possible without things like the Amazon Web Services and Google, that this should open up the firms that run these services to greater scrutiny, to greater government oversight? To you, General Paxton?
Yeah, I do think that's the case. I mean, when the government has stepped in the past, AT&T is a perfect example, or Microsoft, they've stepped in because these companies were so fundamental to how our society operated. And as you noted during this COVID issue that we've been dealing with, look, it was technology that I think was largely responsible for allowing our economy not to decline further than it did. And we had obviously some early on problems, and certain industries like restaurants and airlines were still affected. But if you think about what they were able to do for us, this technology, it really was beneficial to the country that this technology, all these technologies existed. It allowed us to adapt. It's allowing us to continue to adapt and to have our economy move forward, and people have jobs and create wealth and do some of the great things they're doing. However, when you are like AT&T back when they were sued by the government, or you're like a utility that has a complete monopoly, then there is an interest in the government in protecting consumers from abuse by that company. And that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at abusive business practices where basically competitors are eliminated either through just total dominance and being cut off, or being purchased, so that innovation and that competition for the consumer is completely eliminated. And that's where government has a role to step in, so that consumers do have choices, whether it's with what they buy or whether it's what they say.
So James, talk to us a bit about the common carrier issue, or about the extent to which modern life has become impossible without these specific services.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say that the Attorney General makes a compelling argument. I think it's one that's going to resonate with a lot of ordinary Americans, just in virtue of what they experience in real life every day. This isn't, ultimately, it's not some abstruse legalese kabuki dance. This is something that ordinary people experience all the time. I mean, who at this point doesn't have a friend or a family member who's been deplatformed or canceled or been hounded off the internet in some form or another? I think the common carrier argument is going to gain sort of practical force. There used to be a lot of folks on the left who felt that corporations that reached too big of a size were a danger to the republic. That wing of the party seems to have been all but destroyed by the Biden-Harris and the woke corporatist coalition. But it's still a powerful argument. I mean, the big picture here is that big tech is part of an oligarchy, and this oligarchy is damaging our democracy by working, very closely hand in hand with an unelected set of federal officials in the bureaucracy and the intelligence community that have very strong political and in some cases partisan opinions about who should hold power and who should wield power and who should not. And when you have strong private sector oligarchs supporting explicitly one faction of the government, and then you have that same faction, unelected, supporting the agenda of the oligarchs is ostensibly in the private sector, that's a fusion of public and private power that poses a direct threat to America as we have inherited it. It is time, when there is a fire, you should break the glass on the fire extinguisher and pull that tool out of the box. And that's where we are today.
So I wanted to ask General Paxton about another aspect of how big tech operates that perhaps people aren't noticing, and wonder whether or not this sort of thing would also attract the attention of your office and some of your colleague AGs. And that's when you order something on Amazon, I'm told by my spouse, who does this frequently, that you see the choices of what you have to select are always now being promoted with firms that have close contractual relationships with Amazon, most of whom are based in the People's Republic of China. And so you're looking for a certain product, and what ends up happening by default is you get the poorly manufactured product, or the product manufactured by Uyghur slave labor out in Western China, delivered to your door, and you don't even see, unless you really try hard, products that might be made in North America, or products that might appeal to you more. Is this is this another aspect of vertical integration that we should be paying attention to, and how problematic do you think that this practice is?
I think it is problematic, and I think it's going to be a problem going forward as Amazon, as you can see. I mean, I sat at my house for a couple months, and I have actually never been an Amazon user, but I noticed that just with my wife and my daughter, about 1 to 3 products came every day. And so if they're limiting choices, again, if they're the major platform, or they control most of the market, and consumers aren't being shown competing products, and only products that Amazon has some type of business relationship that they're profiting from, then we have potentially the same type of issue with monopolistic behavior. I have not looked at that as closely as I have with Google, where I'm very convinced that there is monopolistic behavior, but that's certainly something that I think needs to be looked at. It's just the resources that it takes to look at these companies is massive, because they are like unto themselves a country with resources greater than most states and most countries. And so you kind of have to take them one bite at a time to take them on, because each endeavor involves a significant amount of resources and a significant fight with a very powerful players.
So James, you may have seen in the news recently a fascinating bit of hypocrisy from our woke corporatist overlords, as you like to describe them. You saw in the case of one of the richest men on the planet, Jeff Bezos, owner of the Washington Post and owner, of course, of Amazon. And you see the official editorial policy from the Post is, of course, that significant expansion of mail-in ballots with very little in the way of identity verification through signature validation, that's okay. But then you also find that Amazon, as a corporation, is opposed to the use of a similar tool called card check with regards efforts to try to unionize the workforce at Amazon. Could you tell us a little bit about what's good for me but not for thee, or vice versa? What's going on here with our oligarchy? Is this inconsistent, or is this perfectly consistent in a certain fashion?
That's right. It's perfectly consistent from the standpoint of self-interest. I mean, this is, when Ronald Reagan was asked what his strategy was for fighting the Cold War, he famously replied, "We win, they lose." This is not behavior that should confuse us, even if it is a little bit stunning to see it wielded so nakedly out in the wild. I mean, this is why the problem of the fusion of private sector and public sector power is so significant. The technology itself has an inherent bias in favor of maximizing interoperability, interchangeability. And the people who control those machines have themselves a separate human interest in making sure that they are the arbiters of one single standard that does not just unify regulation, but makes it uniform. And that poses a threat of its own to our form of government. It's very important that the states right now still do have not only the constitutional prerogative or the headspace to start taking much more assertive actions in determining how the internet is used within their state boundaries or together as a group of states. That isn't necessarily going to last forever if big tech and big government at the federal level has its way. It is important right now to make use of the legal recourse that states have to assert some control over how the internet is done within their bounds. The sooner it's done and the more assertively it's done, the more powerfully states can function as a constitutional counterbalance to the extreme concentrated power of these big tech companies that are strategic parts of basically federal government infrastructure.
So James, let's have you kind of project into the future. And if the response to General Paxton's lawsuit by our judicial system is essentially, I, for one, welcome my new Google overlords. If that's the case and the lawsuit is rejected, could you envision for us the shape that society might take in the next 5 years, the trajectory that our nation might take if there are no brakes on the woke corporate giant that we're facing right now?
Well, it's something that, I think nobody is going to want to see play out in real life. But I do think that there eventually will be breaks. It's just a matter of how much damage is done before we get there. The reality is that a lot of the power And the money that Google amassed was through consolidating advertising. And we're now in a moment when core Google products are not as good as they used to be. I don't know the last time you used Google search, but really, their stated goal was to know what you were looking for before even you do. And that's just an opportunity to convince people that they should simply be told by the algorithm what to look at, what to think about, what to consume. And so, if you're searching for something on Google, you're getting spoon-fed a result they want you to see. You're never going below page 1 of Google search results. The products are not doing well, and as far as I know, just the decisive majority of the money that comes into Google cash flow purposes is through the advertising business, and it's subsidizing these other things that Google is doing that are causing the major concerns. And one of those things is going to be artificial intelligence. That Google has taken the step of firing or letting go at least one woke AI ethics researcher. So I think they're starting to feel some pressure, and the signal that sends is to keep applying the pressure. If they want to continue to do business in anything resembling the form that they've done, they need to make some concessions. And so they've got some chips on their side. They've obviously got lots of money to pay for lots of lawyers. But they are aware of the fact that there are real costs to politicizing their firms, and it's time to start rationing them up.
So I'd like to move to questions from our live stream audience. And the first question I think is best addressed by General Paxton. It's the following: can the relationship between big tech and their subscribers be considered a contract, whether implied or not? And if so, would being blocked or canceled be considered a breach of contract? General Paxton?
I've never thought about it in those terms. I've thought it more from the state standpoint, which would be that these companies are offering something and then they aren't providing what they said. And so there's sort of a fraud on the consumer. Whether these individuals would have some type of contract and then an ability to sue over that contract, maybe they do. I mean, we all have to sign that terms of use thing that very few people read or have time to read, and clearly don't have control over what's in it. So there's also, you could argue that it's a contract of adhesion, or one that is just totally 100% one-sided. So I think that's an interesting theory, and probably one that I think you may see consumers trying in the near future.
This question to James, this viewer asks, how does an individual express their free speech through platforms while big tech companies' bias becomes more prominent? And I would add, it's rather ironic when you see in the wake of former President Trump being canceled off of Twitter, you see these paragons of free speech virtue like Angela Merkel in Germany and Macron in France negatively commenting, saying, are you sure that you really want to be banning the president of the United States off your platform? So how does an individual express their free speech while big tech continues down this woke path? Is that even possible?
It's still possible to some extent, but it's hard to be sure when you are exercising your free speech, when the only content that is let through for you to post on the site is ideologically pre-approved. So the presumption that the platforms are creating is that you are only allowed to really post content if it's of the sort that their filters, their algorithms have already determined is okay to let through. So even beyond just the issue of people getting canceled or deplatformed, is a sort of bigger or meta issue, which is for even more users, their experience is one of saying, why should I do the work of trying to engage with this platform in the way I want when I see my friends getting canceled, I see accounts that I'm used to following getting shadow banned. The friction involved in using what's supposed to be really a seamless and convenient communication service is growing and growing. And so people are being discouraged. And I mean, we saw this with Facebook, where they hit this sort of growth plateau, and that was before wokeness really took hold. So, there's something about social media itself that is becoming decreasingly valuable to the modal user. And you're seeing people move off of platforms like Facebook onto platforms like Signal, which is just kind of a standard encrypted chat app. There are others out there that people are using. A lot of them went to Parler for this reason. But the big picture is, like any web service that hosts your content on the cloud, the cloud is ultimately just someone else's computer. And so if Americans really want to have as robust of a free speech experience online as they can, they need to move off platforms and onto encrypted apps. They need to have their own servers where they can host their own content, and they need to, I think, start moving away from like a freemium model to like a subscription model, or to ultimately to pricing their content in cryptocurrency itself, which is something that some new apps on the rise are doing.
Interesting. So General Paxton, from a standpoint of legal proof, whether criminal or civil levels of proof, how can you prove that big tech companies like Google are negatively impacting individuals with, in this case, the viewer asked, political propaganda? And I might add, it's kind of interesting as we're doing this program, we've got this live stream, we're using these various services that we've been talking about. One of them certainly will be YouTube, which is owned by one of these platforms. I suppose it's entirely possible that they could find this live stream odious and it might vanish. So how do you prove big tech companies are potentially affecting individual free speech with their own political propaganda?
So this is what we're doing right now. We're not only looking at Google, but you might also know that we sent out what are called CIDs, civil investigative demands. They're like interrogatories that, as a state, we can send out under state law, and we send them out to a lot of these tech companies that deplatform the president. Companies like Apple and Google, there were like 5 companies, Twitter, that we sent these CIDs to. And we ask questions. We ask questions first about policy and what are they trying to do. And then if those are not sufficient answers, we continue to ask more questions. And that's what we did with Google. We actually started getting emails and things, that communications among employees and leaders, to try to figure out what was their goal in accomplishing this monopolistic behavior. And those communications tell their own story. And that's what we have to do then, show that those communications are a plan to harm consumers. And if we can show that harm, that's usually where we have an opportunity to do something about it.
Interesting. So a follow-up then, if free market principles appear to be challenged in the big tech market, as we've seen, for example, with Parler being deplatformed or removed via Amazon Web Services, how do we combat these monopolistic tendencies? I mean, when you think of kind of the response, well, if you don't like Twitter, just make your own Twitter. And so Parler did. And in the wake of the former president being banned off of Twitter, you see this gigantic growth in Parler. In fact, it was growing so fast, it was difficult for them to add as many new people as they wanted. And then one day it just all came crashing down, right? Because Amazon Web Services made the decision to sever Parler from the web, and it vanished. So are the free market principles, are they being challenged? And how do we combat, in the case of what I just explained, the issue of Parler being kind of evaporated or eliminated overnight?
Yeah, and I think you hit the crux of the problem. You hear the narrative that, oh, these are private companies, let them do what they want. But when they start doing those type of actions that are anti-competitive and unfair, and because of their size, they can just take away competition, that's where government has to step in, because individuals typically don't have the resources or the capacity or the expertise to deal with it. And frankly, there's very few countries or very few states that can take these companies on. And especially as they get bigger, there'll be less and less place for anybody to even ask the question, let alone do something about it. And so that's where we're at. We've got companies that have eliminated competition, that if any spark of competition occurs, they find a way to cut it off and deplatform and eliminate it so that consumers don't have that choice, while all the while they're advertising, hey, we allow free speech, we allow this, and in reality, they're behind the scenes cutting it all off.
So James, tending back into the uncomfortable to think about, when you were talking about this woke corporate monopoly and where we're headed, and you said that it's not enough to not say the wrong thing. You have to be saying the right thing. It reminded me of what's happening today in the People's Republic of China and the social credit score that's being rolled out there behind the Great Wall of China, where, of course, there is no free speech or no access to external internet sources without the approval of the central government or without people figuring out how to use virtual private networks. So in China, for example, if you say something critical of the ruling oligarchy, that would, assuming you don't get sent off or arrested to some re-education camp, that would give you negative social credit points that would, for example, prevent you from being able to board or buy a ticket for one of China's high-speed trains or a commuter airline, or even send your child to college. But on the other hand, if you were saying good things about a great leader, Xi, then that would give you positive points. Are we beginning to see the potential for something like that here with, for example, people's credit scores being affected or their ability to hold a job or just to function in American life?
What's going on in China is obviously very scary and inimical to the Western way of life, not just in the U.S. but elsewhere. And I would add that in addition to all the horrible things that you mentioned are part of China's social credit system as it unfolds, of course, Chinese subjects, some of the more enterprising ones, are simply building little online bots that can praise dear leader in automated fashion so that they do not have to do this. They figured out ways to hack their fitness devices so that it shows that they're being more physically active than they really are. That can increase your social credit score. So it's easy to see how even in a world where that kind of social credit tyranny were imposed on a people, they would find ways to undermine it. So you get you get too much government and, in a strange sense, too little or too much private corruption. So it's not clear how these things are going to play out in the details. But what does seem clear is that it's not just China that is trying to establish a sovereign internet of its own. Russia wants to do this. India, to a degree, is working on this. Obviously, the EU is taking its own approach to how it wants to structure and regulate the internet. Every civilization state, if I can put it that way, has a strong interest in asserting and establishing a kind of consolidated sovereignty over the internet within its boundaries. Because that's true, there's going to be inherent pressure on government officials to establish nationwide standards for what kind of communications are permitted and what kind are not. So that that puts a country like the United States of America at a special kind of risk, where just structurally, because of the technology itself, it becomes more and more essential to protecting your sovereignty to enforce and police speech codes. So this is why this issue is so sharp, and this is why we need to work extra hard to find ways, and here I'm thinking expressly at the state level, to build some variety and some actual diversity into the speaking of words and the saying of things online in America. If left to its own devices, the technology is going to push us in a direction where there will be one speech code standard, one standard of censoring within each major country that can control its own internet. That's not what the American people want. That's not what they were sold. That's not even what elected officials have transparently said they're working toward achieving. But that's where this is going. And so we really need to, and I think states like Texas, Florida, others have the heft to do this, and they have the enthusiasm and the spirit of most of the American people behind them.
So, General Paxton, I know that if you look at the origins of the modern internet, it was a Pentagon initiative under what was called DARPANET. And of course, the objective was to allow for some communications in a all-out war environment where you had cities that had been destroyed or damaged, and the communications backbone was in trouble. And eventually, of course, legislation was put forward to allow the commercialization of this technology, and we ended up with our modern internet. Now, if you look at the Federal Communications Commission and its role in regulating broadcast, both television and radio, the theory there is that there's only so much spectrum, right? There's only so much radio frequency spectrum to go around, and therefore the federal government has this public interest in regulating and in selling or controlling licenses. But that can't be said of either the public square or the internet, because it's essentially infinite. So how does the government have any sort of a role or a claim that it should be able to regulate these entities? Does it go back to the issue of a common carrier argument, or is there some other legal argument that should be deployed?
Well, first of all, I'm surprised that you didn't include Al Gore in your initial conversation about the internet being created, because I'd always heard that's where it started. But I guess my response would be that government steps in all the time, right or wrong, to look at whether people are being benefited or harmed by actions of companies. And if companies are doing things that are fraudulent, I think we have a responsibility to address that. If they're doing things that harm consumers, we have an obligation to look at that. Beyond that, I think companies should have free rein to operate, to compete. It's just when they start doing harm, when they cross over and start doing harm to other businesses that in an uncompetitive way, or they're starting to do harm to consumers by defrauding them or doing things that hurt their ability to know what the truth is. That's, I think, when government has a responsibility to potentially regulate, and in this case, potentially restructure what's going on.
So, General Paxton, I know that you have a hard stop in a few minutes. You have some other official obligations that you have to take on. So what I was hoping to do is just to ask you one last parting question so that you can have some time to get ready for your next engagement. And that's, what should people be looking for next? What is next, whether through your office or separately on the legal landscape? What is next right now in this antitrust effort against our large internet monopolies?
I mean, right now it's a lot of court fights, and then in addition with this Parler issue and this Twitter issue, that may generate other litigation. The challenge that we have is we're not like the federal government. We don't print money, and so we have to find creative ways to finance the opposition to these types of behaviors. So I'd say it's a combination of litigation action, and that'll be happening not just in Texas, but also with these other states and with the federal government through DOJ, and who knows what's going to happen now that the Biden administration has taken that over. But I think you'll see a lot of action in that arena, but then also our investigation of these other 5 companies that tried to deplatform the president, and us trying to understand whether those are also monopolistic or unfair types of practices.
Thank you very much, Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, and thanks again for joining us. James, in our last few minutes together, when you think of the work that General Paxton is doing and this coalition that he's built with several other states' attorneys general, do you think that it would be impossible to basically conceive that the legal preparation that's going on right now, that's being done on computers using more than likely Microsoft products, communicating via web servers that are probably Amazon web servers or other commercial services that have been purchased by the state of Texas. Do you think it's inconceivable that some of this work could be looked into by some of these companies, that they might be following what's happening in ways that might be inappropriate? I guess I'm just coming right out and asking, to what degree do you think our privacy and security is secure in this day and age from these huge corporations that frankly make a lot of money through our information?
Privacy is weak on the internet. We know from how often our own intelligence community has been pawned by foreign governments, whether it's Russia or China, as far as hacks and the unauthorized copying or taking of federal information is concerned. When Barack Obama was president, he said, if you don't want it to be found out, make sure that it's something you would be comfortable putting in an email. Our leaders have signaled from time to time that the presumption of privacy on the internet is not grounded in fact or in reality. It is very easy for the best hackers to do what they do. Obviously, there are some defensive tools as well, and this is why end-to-end encryption is so important. By the same token, this is why folks like Steve Mnuchin and even former Attorney General of the United States, Barr, don't particularly like end-to-end encryption. The intelligence community and others in the bureaucracy are very firmly in favor of building backdoors into every device, so that information is even more accessible to them. And it's inevitable that there's going to be at least some kind of robust national security argument that you can make. Well, we live in dangerous times, and we need to make sure that the good guys can get into the bad guys' devices. But in reality, what happens is that the presumption of privacy leaches away. I think that there are so many Americans right now who have been maneuvered into a position by the federal government where they have no savings, where they carry recurring debts that they're just servicing and not really paying down, that the internet has taken on, as you suggested, this outsized importance, where so many Americans lack the capital or lack the enterprise skill to start and maintain businesses of their own. And they think like, well, at least I can become a YouTuber, or at least I can avail myself of these free services from big tech where I can, maybe build an audience that one day I can monetize. Many people are being moved into this direction. And as a result, they are becoming unnaturally dependent on the internet, not just as a strategic resource or as a technology that becomes a sort of new standard for the way that business is done, but as really the only sort of bottleneck or gateway point to participate in commerce. That gives the big tech companies an even greater power than simply what an antitrust suit would be likely to address. So I think Americans really need to, if it hasn't happened to them already, the scales need to fall from their eyes. They need to recognize that if they want truly private communications, and if they really want to sort of exercise their agency as citizens and as market participants, they need to make sure that they're using tools that help them to do that rather than hinder them.
Well, thank you very much. If you've been following for the last a few minutes, we've been joined today by Texas Public Policy Foundation's Monday live stream by the Attorney General of the great state of Texas, Ken Paxton, as well as James Poulos. We've been taking on the topic of the increasing monopolistic trends of America's big tech corporations and what might be done about it. Again, my name is Chuck DeVore. I'm Vice President of National Initiatives at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and thanks for watching.